Some people mistake memory for weakness, until they discover that love remembers everything. The sound of crystal glasses and quiet laughter drifted beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Whitmore Foundation Gala, where every polished marble floor reflected wealth, influence, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Among the hundreds of elegantly dressed guests, one elderly woman wandered slowly through the grand ballroom, her silver hair neatly pinned, her pale blue cardigan buttoned with trembling fingers despite the warm spring evening. Eleanor Moretti paused beside a table covered with white roses, gently touching one delicate bloom before whispering to herself, "Thomas always loved these." Her late husband had been gone for nearly 20 years, but Alzheimer's disease refused to respect calendars or reality. Tonight, in Eleanor's fading world, Thomas was simply running late. A few feet behind her, Grace Carter watched with quiet patience, never taking her eyes off the older woman for more than a heartbeat. Grace had spent the last 18 months caring for Eleanor, learning the invisible map of memories that appeared and disappeared without warning. She knew which songs calmed her, which stories made her smile, and which crowded rooms could leave her frightened and confused. She also knew something no one else in the ballroom seemed to understand. Eleanor Moretti had once been the heart of one of the most powerful families in New York, and even if her memories faded, her dignity never should. "Mrs. Moretti," Grace called gently, walking toward her with an encouraging smile. "Let's stay together, okay?" Eleanor looked over with warm but uncertain eyes. "Have you seen my husband? He promised he'd meet me before dinner." Grace's expression softened without a trace of pity. "I'm sure he'd want you to enjoy these beautiful flowers while you wait." Eleanor smiled, accepting the answer as if it made perfect sense, then reached into the pocket of her cardigan and carefully removed a delicate lace handkerchief embroidered with the initials TM. It had belonged to Thomas Moretti, preserved for decades as though time itself had refused to touch it. Eleanor held it carefully against her heart, unaware that someone across the room had already noticed her. Cassandra Whitmore stood surrounded by donors, socialites, and television cameras, wearing a designer ivory gown that had become the center of every conversation that evening. She enjoyed attention the way others enjoyed sunlight, believing every room naturally belonged to her. As she watched Eleanor drift slowly toward the champagne display, her polished smile tightened into quiet irritation. "Who invited her?" Cassandra muttered under her breath, glancing at one of the event coordinators. "She's wandering around like she doesn't even know where she is." The coordinator shifted awkwardly. "She's Mrs. Eleanor Moretti." Cassandra gave a dismissive laugh. "Then someone should escort her somewhere else before she embarrasses herself." Grace immediately sensed the change in the atmosphere. Years of working inside wealthy homes had taught her to recognize the moment kindness quietly disappeared from a room. She gently reached for Eleanor's arm, hoping to guide her toward a quieter corner before anyone else noticed. But Eleanor suddenly looked toward the ballroom entrance, her face lighting up with innocent hope. "Thomas," she whispered happily, taking a few slow steps forward, believing she had finally seen the man she had loved her entire life. She never realized she was walking directly into Cassandra Whitmore's path. Cassandra barely slowed her pace as Eleanor stepped into her path. Instead of offering the simple courtesy that every child was taught, she frowned as though an inconvenience had interrupted something important. Eleanor looked up with hopeful eyes, still searching the crowd for the husband only she could see. "Thomas?" she whispered softly, taking another uncertain step. Before Grace could reach her, Cassandra lifted one perfectly manicured hand and shoved Eleanor aside with an impatient motion that was careless rather than forceful, yet enough to steal the older woman's balance. Eleanor stumbled backward, catching herself against the edge of the champagne table as several crystal glasses rattled loudly. A gasp rippled through the nearby guests, but no one moved. The room had become strangely fascinated by the unfolding scene. Grace hurried forward, placing both hands gently around Eleanor's shoulders before she could lose her footing completely. "Mrs. Moretti, you are all right?" she said calmly, her voice warm enough to steady the frightened woman. Eleanor blinked several times, confusion replacing the hopeful smile that had filled her face only seconds earlier. She looked down at the lace handkerchief still clutched in her trembling fingers as though trying to understand why her heart suddenly felt so heavy. Cassandra looked at the small wrinkle on her designer gown with exaggerated annoyance. "Does someone intend to supervise her?" she asked loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "This is a charity gala, not a nursing home." A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room, but no one laughed. Even those accustomed to wealth sensed that something about her words had crossed an invisible line. Grace kept her attention on Eleanor, carefully smoothing the older woman's cardigan. "She did not mean to disturb anyone," Grace replied with quiet dignity. "We will move to another area." Cassandra folded her arms. "Of course she did not. She probably does not even remember where she is." Eleanor slowly raised her eyes toward Cassandra, her expression filled not with anger, but with heartbreaking uncertainty. "I am sorry," she said politely. "Did I do something wrong?" The sincerity in her voice only deepened the silence surrounding them. Grace gently squeezed Eleanor's hand. "No, ma'am. You did nothing wrong." Cassandra let out a short laugh that echoed much louder than she intended beneath the chandeliers. "She cannot even answer for herself. Amazing." Grace finally lifted her eyes to meet Cassandra's. There was no hatred in her expression, only calm conviction. "Memory can fade," she said evenly, "but respect should never disappear." Several guests exchanged nervous glances. One elderly donor quietly lowered his eyes. Another woman discreetly stepped closer, clearly uncomfortable with what she was witnessing. Eleanor looked down at the handkerchief again, gently brushing a tiny crease from the delicate fabric. With the tenderness of someone protecting her last connection to a lifetime of love. Then, almost instinctively, she held it against her cheek and smiled faintly. "Thomas gave this to me on our anniversary," she whispered. "He said I should always keep it close." Grace smiled softly. "Then let us keep it safe." Cassandra rolled her eyes before taking one deliberate step closer. Her gaze settled on the fragile lace handkerchief with open contempt, completely unaware that dozens of quiet eyes had begun watching not Eleanor, not Grace, but every choice she was about to make. Cassandra reached toward the lace handkerchief with two careless fingers, lifting one corner as though it were an old piece of fabric that had somehow wandered into an elegant ballroom. "This?" she said with a faint smirk. "People bring sentimental junk to black tie events now?" Before Grace could answer, Cassandra released the delicate cloth, allowing it to drift into a shallow splash of spilled champagne resting beside the crystal glasses. The pale lace immediately absorbed the golden liquid. Eleanor gasped quietly. She stared at the damp handkerchief without moving, her eyes filling with confusion rather than anger. It was as though she understood that something precious had been harmed, even if she could no longer remember every reason why it mattered. Grace immediately bent down and lifted the handkerchief with both hands, treating it with the same care someone might show a priceless family photograph. She gently folded the wet corner inward, protecting the embroidered initials before looking up at Cassandra with calm composure. "This belonged to her husband," Grace said softly. "She has carried it for decades." Cassandra shrugged without the slightest hint of remorse. "Then perhaps it belongs in a museum instead of my gala." A quiet murmur spread through the surrounding guests. Several people shifted uncomfortably. An elderly couple exchanged disappointed glances. A young violinist near the stage briefly stopped watching his music, distracted by the tension unfolding across the ballroom. Eleanor reached slowly toward Grace. "Is Thomas upset with me?" she asked in an almost childlike voice. Grace's heart tightened, but her expression remained gentle. She carefully placed the folded handkerchief back into Eleanor's trembling hands. "No, Mrs. Moretti. If anything, he would be proud of how gracefully you carry his memory." Eleanor smiled faintly, holding the cloth against her heart once again. "He always said kindness costs nothing," she whispered. "He never liked people arguing." Grace nodded. "He sounds like a wise man." Cassandra let out a dismissive breath. "How touching." Her voice carried just enough volume to reach nearby reporters and donors. Some people should simply stay home when they cannot manage public events. Grace slowly stood, keeping herself between Eleanor and the growing crowd. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, she replied, especially those who cannot defend themselves. For the first time that evening, Cassandra's smile faded. She had expected embarrassment, apologies, perhaps even tears. Instead, the woman standing before her refused to surrender her composure. Grace spoke without raising her voice, without anger, and somehow that quiet confidence unsettled Cassandra more than any argument could have. Neither woman noticed the subtle change spreading through the ballroom. Conversations gradually stopped. The string quartet continued playing, but fewer guests paid attention to the music. Eyes turned not toward the stage, but toward the small circle forming around Eleanor. At the far end of the grand staircase overlooking the ballroom, a tall man in a perfectly tailored black suit had entered through a private corridor moments earlier. He had been expected much later in the evening, and almost no one noticed his arrival. His steady gaze swept across the ballroom until it found his mother clutching a damp lace handkerchief against her chest while Grace stood protectively beside her. He remained completely still. His face revealed nothing. His hands rested calmly at his sides. Yet those who knew Vincent Moretti well understood one unmistakable truth. Whenever he became this quiet, the entire room was about to remember the difference between wealth and true power. Vincent Moretti did not announce his arrival. He simply stood at the top of the sweeping marble staircase with one hand resting lightly on the polished railing, his quiet presence carrying more authority than any speech delivered that evening. From where he stood, he could see his mother holding the damp lace handkerchief against her chest with confused eyes, and beside her stood Grace Carter, shielding Eleanor with nothing except calm courage and quiet compassion. Vincent did not move immediately. He watched. He had learned long ago that people revealed their true character when they believed no one important was paying attention. Down below, Cassandra continued speaking as though she owned every inch of the ballroom. "Someone should really take responsibility," she declared with an exaggerated sigh. "Guests come here expecting elegance, not scenes like this." Several donors looked away in visible discomfort. One older gentleman quietly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Another guest whispered something to his wife before both fell completely silent. Grace refused to match Cassandra's tone. She simply adjusted Eleanor's cardigan, smoothing the sleeve with gentle care before quietly asking, "Would you like to sit down for a few minutes, Mrs. Moretti?" Eleanor looked around the crowded ballroom with growing uncertainty. "Did I ruin the party?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to break several hearts at once. Grace immediately shook her head. "No, ma'am. You brought kindness into this room. That can never ruin anything." Eleanor smiled faintly, though tears shimmered in the corners of her fading blue eyes. "Thomas always told me that people remember how you make them feel." Grace nodded with quiet warmth. "I think he was absolutely right." Those simple words reached farther than either woman realized. They reached the guests standing nearby. They reached the photographers who had quietly lowered their cameras. And they reached Vincent, who remained perfectly still as he listened from above. For a brief moment, memories flooded his mind with startling clarity. He remembered his mother volunteering every Thanksgiving before wealth had ever entered their lives. He remembered her, insisting that every employee at their first family restaurant sit at the same holiday table. He remembered her telling a teenage Vincent that power meant nothing if it could not protect someone weaker than yourself. Alzheimer's disease had stolen countless memories from Eleanor, but it had not erased the woman who had created his conscience. Meanwhile, Cassandra mistook the growing silence for agreement. She straightened her shoulders and smiled toward a nearby reporter. "These charity events require standards," she said confidently. "Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for everyone's comfort." Grace finally looked directly at her. There was no anger in her expression, only disappointment. Comfort built on humiliating another person is never worthy of respect. The sentence landed with surprising weight. No one answered. No one defended Cassandra. Even the string quartet seemed softer now, the music fading into the background as every eye shifted between the two women. High above them, Vincent slowly released the railing. His expression remained unreadable, but those who recognized him from across the ballroom immediately fell silent. One executive quietly stepped backward. A senator stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. A hotel manager lowered his champagne glass without taking another sip. The atmosphere changed before Vincent ever took his first step. Then, with measured confidence, he began walking down the staircase toward his mother, each unhurried step echoing across the ballroom until the only sound left in the grand hall was the rhythm of polished leather shoes meeting marble. By the time Vincent Moretti reached the final step, the ballroom had become so quiet that the faint melody from the string quartet seemed impossibly distant. He walked directly past reporters, politicians, executives, and donors without acknowledging a single greeting. His attention never drifted from the elderly woman standing beside Grace Carter. Eleanor looked up as he approached, studying his face with uncertain eyes. For a brief moment, confusion clouded her expression. Then a gentle smile appeared. "Thomas?" she asked hopefully. Vincent's expression softened in a way almost no one present had ever witnessed. He stepped close enough to carefully straighten the collar of her cardigan before answering in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "No, Mom. It is Vincent." Eleanor blinked several times before touching his cheek with trembling fingers. "Vincent," she repeated slowly. "My handsome little boy." A faint smile crossed Vincent's face. "I am right here." Eleanor looked down at the damp lace handkerchief resting in her hands. "I tried to keep it safe," she whispered apologetically. "I am sorry." Vincent gently folded her fingers around the delicate fabric. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing at all." Grace quietly stepped back, allowing mother and son their moment together. Vincent glanced toward her with silent gratitude before returning his attention to Eleanor. "Did anyone hurt you?" he asked softly. Eleanor hesitated, searching through memories that no longer stayed where they belonged. She looked from Vincent to Grace, then toward the crowd. I cannot remember," Grace answered with complete honesty. She became frightened after someone treated her without kindness. Vincent slowly nodded. He did not interrupt. He did not rush to conclusions. Instead, he asked the question that caused every person in the ballroom to hold their breath. "Grace, tell me exactly what happened." Grace lowered her eyes briefly before answering. Mrs. Moretti accidentally stepped into Miss Whitmore's path while looking for her husband. Miss Whitmore pushed her aside. Mrs. Moretti nearly lost her balance. After that, her handkerchief ended up in spilled champagne. She never raised her voice. She never exaggerated a single detail. She simply described what she had witnessed with calm precision. Cassandra immediately stepped forward, forcing an elegant smile that no longer reached her eyes. "Vincent, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. It was crowded. She wandered into me, and I was only trying to protect the guests." Vincent finally turned toward Cassandra. His expression remained perfectly composed, which somehow felt more intimidating than anger. "Is that what happened?" he asked. Cassandra nodded. Confidently, "Unfortunately, yes." Grace seems emotionally involved and probably interpreted the situation incorrectly. Grace said nothing. She simply stood beside Eleanor with quiet dignity, refusing to defend herself beyond the truth she had already spoken. Vincent looked around the ballroom, studying the faces surrounding him. Many guests lowered their eyes. Others exchanged uneasy glances. No one volunteered to support Cassandra's version of events. Vincent noticed that silence. He had spent his entire life reading rooms more accurately than words. Then his gaze settled on a discreet security camera mounted high above the ballroom entrance. Without changing his calm tone, he looked toward the event manager standing near the stage. "Please bring me the security footage from the last 10 minutes. The manager froze for a heartbeat before immediately nodding. Cassandra's confident smile disappeared so quickly that even those standing several yards away noticed the change. For the first time that evening, uncertainty replaced arrogance, while Vincent never looked away from her face. No one spoke while the event manager hurried across the ballroom. The only sounds came from polished shoes moving across marble and the quiet hum of the projection equipment being prepared near the stage. Cassandra tried to maintain her composure, folding her hands neatly in front of her as though confidence alone could reshape reality. "Vincent," she said with a measured smile, "surely we do not need to interrupt an evening devoted to charity over a simple misunderstanding." Vincent remained beside his mother without looking at her. He carefully adjusted the damp lace handkerchief in Eleanor's hands before answering. "Respect is never a small matter." Eleanor looked up at him with gentle confusion. "Are we going home soon?" she asked. Vincent smiled softly. "Soon, Mom. I just need to make sure everything is right first." She nodded as though that answer settled every concern in her heart. Grace remained quietly beside Eleanor, ready to steady her if she became overwhelmed by the growing crowd. Several guests instinctively stepped closer to the edges of the ballroom, creating an open space around the four of them. No one wanted to interrupt what they sensed was becoming far more important than a fundraising gala. The event manager returned carrying a tablet connected wirelessly to the ballroom's large presentation screen. His hands shook slightly as he approached Vincent. "The security recording is ready, sir." Vincent accepted the tablet with a calm nod before handing it back. "Play it for everyone." A nervous silence swept across the room as the enormous screen came to life. The recording showed the ballroom exactly as it had looked only minutes earlier. Guests watched themselves chatting, servers carrying silver trays, musicians performing beneath crystal chandeliers. Then Eleanor appeared, walking slowly while smiling at the white roses. Grace followed only a few steps behind, never taking her eyes off the elderly woman. The room remained silent. The recording continued. Eleanor turned, believing she had seen her late husband, and unknowingly stepped into Cassandra's path. The video clearly showed that Cassandra had ample space to move aside. Instead, she lifted her hand and impatiently pushed Eleanor away. The older woman stumbled against the champagne table. Crystal glasses rattled. Grace rushed forward immediately to protect her. No one in the ballroom looked away from the screen. The recording continued with painful clarity. It showed Cassandra speaking while Eleanor stood frightened and confused. It showed Grace gently comforting her. Then came the moment that removed every remaining doubt. Cassandra reached toward the lace handkerchief, lifted it with visible disdain, and deliberately released it into the spilled champagne before smiling dismissively. A quiet gasp spread through the ballroom. Several people lowered their heads. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. One donor quietly whispered, "My goodness!" Cassandra's face lost every trace of color. "That is not what it looks like," she said quickly. "The camera angle is misleading. I only meant to move it out of the way." No one answered. The recording had spoken with complete honesty. Vincent allowed the final seconds of the footage to finish before the screen faded. Back to black. He slowly turned toward Cassandra, his expression unchanged. Calm, controlled, impossible to read. Yet everyone present understood that the truth had already delivered its own judgment long before he spoke a single word. Even Eleanor, unable to remember exactly what had happened, instinctively reached for Grace's hand, sensing that kindness had quietly prevailed over cruelty, while the entire ballroom stood in absolute silence, waiting to hear what Vincent Moretti would do next. Vincent allowed the silence to settle over the ballroom before speaking. He had spent years negotiating with politicians, business leaders, and men whose fortunes depended upon every word he chose. Tonight, however, his voice carried none of the sharpness people feared. Carried disappointment, and somehow that felt far heavier. "Miss Whitmore," he said evenly, "my mother may not remember every face she meets, but I remember every person who chooses to dishonor her." Cassandra struggled to recover the confidence that had abandoned her moments earlier. She forced a nervous smile and folded her hands together. "Vincent, I admitted the situation looked unfortunate, but surely this does not deserve such attention. Everyone makes mistakes." Vincent looked directly into her eyes. "A mistake is spilling a glass of water. A mistake is forgetting a name." Humiliating someone who cannot defend herself is a choice. The words echoed across the ballroom with remarkable clarity. No one interrupted. No one attempted to rescue Cassandra from the truth now standing beside her. One of the television reporters quietly lowered his microphone. Another guest slowly set his champagne flute onto a nearby table, unwilling to make even the smallest sound. Cassandra glanced around the room, searching for familiar allies, but the expressions she found were not sympathetic. They were uncomfortable. Some people avoided looking at her altogether. Others looked directly at her for the first time that evening, no longer seeing an elegant philanthropist but a woman whose character had been revealed in front of everyone. Grace gently adjusted Eleanor's cardigan once more as the older woman whispered, "Why is everyone so quiet?" Grace smiled reassuringly. "Because people are listening now." Eleanor nodded, accepting the answer with peaceful innocence. She held the lace handkerchief close to her heart, carefully smoothing the embroidered initials with her thumb as though protecting the memory stitched into every thread. Vincent watched his mother for a moment before turning back toward Cassandra. "Do you know what my mother taught me when I was 10 years old?" Cassandra remained silent. "She told me that the easiest way to judge a person's character is not by how they treat someone important. It is by how they treat the person who cannot offer them anything in return." His gaze slowly moved across the ballroom. Tonight, everyone here witnessed that lesson. Cassandra swallowed hard. "I was under pressure. There were cameras. The event had to remain organized." Vincent gave a slight shake of his head. "Kindness does not become optional because people are watching." Those words settled over the room like a final verdict. An elderly donor quietly began applauding. It was only one pair of hands at first. Then another guest joined. Then another. The applause was not loud or celebratory. It was respectful. It was directed toward Grace, who had stood beside Eleanor without seeking attention, and toward Eleanor herself, whose dignity had quietly reminded everyone of values that wealth could never purchase. Grace looked surprised, lowering her eyes with humility, while Eleanor smiled gently, believing perhaps that the music had started again. Vincent waited until the applause faded before speaking one final sentence. "The measure of a society is not found in the luxury of its ballroom. It is found in the compassion it shows its most vulnerable guests." Once again, the room fell completely silent, and this time no one mistook silence for weakness. It had become respect. Cassandra stood motionless as the applause faded, her carefully crafted image unraveling in a way she had never imagined possible. Only minutes earlier she had been the center of admiration, surrounded by cameras, influential guests, and executives eager to shake her hand. Now those same people quietly stepped away, creating a space around her that felt larger with every passing second. Vincent did not raise his voice. He did not threaten her. Instead, he turned toward the chairman of the Whitmore Foundation, an elderly businessman whose face had grown pale during the entire exchange. "Mr. Henderson," Vincent said calmly, "does your foundation claim to stand for compassion, dignity, and service to the community?" The chairman hesitated before answering. "Yes, those values are written into everything we represent." Vincent nodded once. "Then tonight your guests have witnessed whether those values exist only on paper or in practice." Mr. Henderson slowly removed the event program from his hands and looked toward Cassandra with unmistakable disappointment. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "I believe the board will need to review your leadership immediately." Cassandra's eyes widened. "Surely you cannot mean that. I have spent years building this organization." "An organization built to serve people cannot be represented by someone who humiliates them," the chairman replied. Around the ballroom, several board members exchanged solemn nods. One by one they approached Mr. Henderson, speaking in low voices that needed no microphones. Within moments the decision became clear. The chairman faced the room again. "Effective immediately, Miss Whitmore is relieved of all responsibilities connected with this foundation until a full review is completed." A stunned silence followed. Reporters who had originally arrived expecting photographs of wealthy donors now quietly recorded every word. No one rushed forward to defend Cassandra. Even her own business associates remained where they stood, unwilling to attach their names to what everyone had just witnessed. Cassandra looked desperately toward Vincent. "You planned this." Vincent answered without hesitation. "No. You planned it yourself the moment you decided another human being deserved less respect because she was vulnerable." His words carried no anger, only certainty. Grace looked toward Eleanor, who seemed blissfully unaware of the professional consequences unfolding around her. The older woman smiled as she gently unfolded the lace handkerchief once more. "Thomas always said people should forgive," she whispered. Grace smiled warmly. "He must have been a remarkable man." Eleanor nodded. "He tried every day to be kind." Vincent heard those words and quietly closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them again, he looked toward Grace. "Thank you for protecting my mother when others chose not to." Grace lowered her head respectfully. "She protected something much more important tonight, sir." She reminded everyone what kindness looks like. Several guests quietly nodded in agreement. A young waitress standing near the ballroom entrance wiped away a tear before returning to her duties. An elderly couple reached for each other's hands. The atmosphere that had once celebrated wealth now celebrated something far more valuable. Cassandra slowly realized that nothing Vincent had done involved revenge. He had simply allowed the truth to remain visible long enough for everyone else to make their own decisions. In the end, it was not power that cost her the admiration she had spent years collecting. It was her own choice, witnessed by an entire room that would never forget what dignity looked like when it refused to surrender. Edit Vincent gently offered his arm, and Eleanor accepted it with the quiet trust of a mother who no longer remembered every chapter of her life, but still recognized the feeling of safety. Together they began walking toward the ballroom entrance, with Grace beside them carrying nothing except the small lace handkerchief that had already been carefully dried with a clean linen napkin. The guests instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path without a single word being spoken. No one wanted to interrupt the peaceful dignity of that